All right, so let's review a little bit. How many books of the Bible are there? Tell. There are 66 books. How many testaments? Cece. I heard 10, but then I heard 2. All right, how many books are in the... Lillian?
39.
That is incorrect. How many books are in the New Testament? Titus. All right. How many books are in the Old Testament? Joshua. 39. All right. Let's see. There are 3 kinds of books in the Old Testament. What are the 3 kinds of books, Benjamin? Titus. Go ahead. You're thinking. Yep. Historic? No. Prophetic. All right. What kind of books are in the New Testament, Lara? How many kinds of books are there in the New Testament, Titus? Well, if you know the answer to the first question, you definitely know the answer to the second question. Huh? We have 3 and 4. Joshua, which is correct, 3 or 4? No, the types of books in the New Testament. I need an adult to weigh in. All the kids are confused. Bless you. 3. All right. What are those kind of books? Titus. Oh, we're in the New Testament, son. Prophets are in the Old Testament. One of them's just like the Old Testament. Historic. There we go. Pauline epistles. Yep, Paul's letters. General epistles. Very good. All right. So that's just kind of the quick and dirty. Now, we started last week on lesson 2 talking about this arc of Bible history, or this timeline of Bible history that we could look at. And we said there are how many eras? Does anybody remember? Benjamin. 3 eras? That's how many we covered, right? We covered 3. How many were there in total? Titus. 12, right. So you can read there. That's actually on your notes tonight. So we started off with the first one, and the first era we started was creation. I didn't leave you any lines here because we already covered this material. The second era that we covered was the era of CC. Joshua. Patriarchs. The third era that we covered was Benjamin. Exodus, right. What's the fourth era? So you think about it. Now this is, we're going to start kind of trying to chain together some of our Sunday school stuff that we have been learning over the years that you've been in Sunday school here, kind of synthesize this material into something that's cohesive. So after the children of Israel left the promised land, and that's the Exodus era, what did they do next to Lara? Okay, they went into the wilderness, and we said last week that the wilderness was part of that Exodus era, but you are correct. What happened after when they left the wilderness, where did they go? Joshua fought the battle of? Jericho. I was waiting for Joshua. Jericho, right. So, why did Joshua fight the battle of Jericho? Lara. So the wall, no, that's how he won, because the wall went tumbling down. Titus, why did he fight that? Okay, what land? The land of Jericho? Or the whole promised land? The whole promised land, okay? So we get into this fourth era, and the word that you want to write in there is the word conquest. Conquest. Why are... All right, so conquest is the name of the era. It is our fourth era. Now, the events in the conquest, it covers Israel's conquest of Canaan, which was the promised land. Okay, so you were very much correct in saying he attacked Jericho because God said he was going to give him the promised land. And so he started into it. What book contains the details of these events? Benjamin. Okay, which books have we looked at so far? Okay. Joshua is the correct answer. Right, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. Joshua, the events of that battle and all the battles that follow are recorded in the book of Joshua. The place where the conquest era took place is the land of Canaan. Now, this sounds familiar. We've heard things called Canaan before. And indeed, a lot of the Bible actually occurs right in this very small area of land, known as the land of Canaan. We get in the New Testament, we're going to change its name, but it's basically still the same land. And so a lot of the Bible's history happens right there. Who is the person who's kind of like the key person, the most important person of this entire conquest era, do you suppose? Talara? Joshua, right out there on the limb, no chainsaws in sight. Joshua is the key person in this era. In fact, after Joshua passes off the scene and his generation passes off the scene, things get funky fast. They get crazy very, very quickly. All right, question on the conquest era, excuse me. All right, the next era, kind of just tipped my hand, is the Titus. Not the judgment, the judges. It's called the Judges. Now, we have what is basically a 400-year time period of Israel being ruled by temporary leaders that were called judges. Hence, the era is named Judges. Now, Benjamin seems to think he knows what book is covered, or what book covers the Judges period. Benjamin, the book of Judges is the primary historical book. This era, we actually get a secondary historical book that goes along with it. Joshua? Ruth, that is correct. The events in the book of Ruth, which we're actually going to start on Sunday mornings in a couple weeks, occur during this Judges period. Okay? And so what we'll see in Ruth is going to give us some added detail, a little bit of different information that is in the main historical book there in the book of Judges. It just gives us some color, some detail, some stuff. The place, if we were to say that the Judges happened in a place, what place would that be? The land of Canaan, right, same place. Now here's a tough one, and I think you have it for a line. The key person of the time of Judges. Now, let me entertain some ideas here. Who could the key person in the book of Judges be, just based on what you know of this particular era? Cece. Okay, this is a couple thousand years before Jesus, so that wouldn't work so well. Lillian? Okay, Samuel is a good candidate. Samuel was there right at the end of the era of the Judges, and actually it was Samuel who was kind of responsible for ushering Israel into the next era. We'll talk about that in a second. So you could say that Samuel would make a good key person, if not right at the end. It's not the person I picked, and I'll tell you who and why in a second. Who else do we know about the Judges? We just talked about them in Sunday school last year, so hopefully you have some remembrance of some of them. Benjamin? Okay, Samson was a judge. All right, Titus? Gideon was a judge. Yeah, look, Gideon's like, what, me? Yeah, you. All right, Lillian? Job? No, Job before. Job, we already passed his time period. Talara? Ehud was a judge, yep. He was a judge, and he delivered Israel from the Amalekites. Was there any girls that were judges? I hear Deborah being whispered around. Okay, Deborah was, and she was kind of partnered with somebody. Barak, not Barack, Barak. Yeah. Sounds like certain people alive today. Anybody else? Think of a judge that you remember. Okay, well, just who would make a good key person to you? All right, you guys exhausted your gray cells? All right, so no, Solomon comes later. So the person that I chose is the key person for this era, and you could pick a couple of people. It's actually Samson. And the reason I picked Samson is, one, just sheer popularity. People know who Samson was. Like, even once you get outside of church, there's a little bit of an idea about Samson in pop culture. Not a ton, but a little bit. But the other reason is Samson, as a judge, really embodied the spirit of this era. Israel was kind of a mess spiritually during the time of the judges, and Samson was a mess spiritually. And so he was a judge, but he also embodied kind of the spirit of this era, at least for my thinking. Any questions? Now, we said that Samuel was the last of the judges, and he ushered in the next era. What did Samuel do that ushered in the next era? Lillian. Okay, he named Saul the king. Right, he anointed Saul to be the king. So what do you think we call the next era, Talara? No, not the anointment. Benjamin? Saul, the worst king ever? No. He actually wasn't the worst king by far. Okay, we call this era the kingdom era because it was an era that Israel had a king, right? And so the events of the kingdom era, it covers roughly a 400 years period where Israel had a monarchy. Now, one of the numbers that you're going to start to see coming up a bit is this number 400. Okay, 400 years, a lot of things break down to roughly 400 years. What do I mean by roughly? Not exact 400 years, but roughly 400 years. How long were the children of Israel in Egypt? Roughly 400 years. How many years were there judges in Israel? Roughly 400 years. How many years was there kings in Israel? Roughly 400 years. Right, you start to see this repetition of these 400-year mark eras that are going on. And I don't think that's accidental, but it's an interesting observation. Now, when we get to the kingdom era, there's actually two kind of sub-periods or sub-eras in the kingdom era. The first of them is called the United Kingdom. Not in England, the United Kingdom of Israel. And we call it the United Kingdom because the whole nation of Israel was united together under one king. The United Kingdom actually only lasted for 3 kings. That was Saul, David, and Solomon. Okay, after the death of Solomon, the nation of Israel broke into 2 parts, and we call that era the divided kingdom era. And so they're both part of the kingdom era, but you have United Kingdom and you have divided kingdom. During the divided kingdom era, the northern 10 tribes formed one nation, and they kept the name Israel because they were the most people. They got a new king, however. It wasn't Solomon's son. They got a new king. The 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin stayed together. They stayed under Solomon's son as king, and they took on the name Judah because Judah was the larger of the 2 tribes. And so you have this all going on during the kingdom era. Let's see, the history of the United Kingdom era, and I think I have it written down there for you. 1 Samuel through 2 Kings. So 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. The secondary history is 1 and 2 Chronicles. Okay, they don't carry the main weight of history, but they certainly add some detail and some flavor and some color to what you have through Samuel's and Kings. Now, what is the place that the kingdom happened? Talara. Israel. Is it the same place as Canaan? Yes, exact same place, new name. They are established as a defined nation among the world, and the whole area now is called Israel. But it's same place that they've been working all along this time. Who is the key person, if you were to guess, for the kingdom era? And I think you could almost pick two, but we'll see. Got hands up all over the room. Joshua. What's that? Okay, Saul. Why would you pick Saul? Okay, he was the first king. Not a bad thought process. Titus. Saul's son was not king. Now, I say that. He wasn't really... Yeah. Jonathan never took the throne, was certainly not recognized as a king. He did kind of here and there act like one, certainly more than his dad at times. Let's see, Lillian, before you jump out of your shorts. David, okay, why do you say David? Because he was the second king. Okay, who agrees with David? Okay, Cece, why would you say David? Okay, well, all the kings were anointed, but okay. Talara. He got to kill the giant, but he did that before he was king, but okay. Let's see, Joshua. Jesus came from his ancestry. Good and very important point. And because we know a lot about him. That's not a bad thing either, Benjamin. Were you agreeing with David? Okay. Talara. Okay. Okay. Does anybody think Solomon? Now, of these three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, which king actually had the greatest kingdom? No. Solomon did. Solomon actually governed more land than David did. Solomon had more wealth than David did. Solomon had more influence than David did. And historians are very much in agreement that Israel really reached its golden era under Solomon, not under David. You guess Solomon. You're going to change your vote now, huh? All right, so how many of you still think David? How many of you decided to Solomon? I sold Solomon. How many of you think Saul? I'm going to actually go with David. I think David was, for one thing, he was the beginning point of that Davidic line. And so you get Solomon was his son, and then all of the kings that came after Solomon were all in David's line. To Joshua's point, Jesus comes through David's line. That is an inescapable point. He is generally the most well-known of the Israelite kings. And all of Solomon's success, I mean, Solomon was very wise and all of that, but most of Solomon's success were built on the foundation of what David did. So David got things started. It was David who conquered the Jebusites and made Jerusalem his capital. It was David who started the building projects and started a palace and who really organized the worship of Israel. David, because he was a musician, was able to do that. Even though he wasn't a priest, he was a king. He was able to get all of the worship of Israel sorted out. The organization of worship that David put in lasted all the way to and through the time of Jesus. The orders of priests that he established were still functioning thousands of years later in the time of Jesus. You get all of the Psalms. Even the temple that Solomon built, David actually started the process. David wasn't allowed to build the temple, so he just collected all the supplies, so that when Solomon was ready to start building, they could just start building. And so Solomon built and expanded, but David really got the ball rolling. And so I think David really is really the key person of that era. How long was the kingdom era? Talara? Roughly 400 years, right. Everything's roughly 400. Was it exactly 400 years? No, it's not exactly, but it's roughly 400 years. What era followed? What happened after the kingdom era? So you have, let me back up a little bit. So you have David and you have Solomon and they're ruling and everything's great and hunky-dory and happy and all that. And then things start breaking down after Solomon and the nation splits into two nations, this divided kingdom era. And the Judah, the nation of Judah has some good kings and they have some bad kings. The nation of Israel has no good kings. All of the kings that Israel ever had in the divided kingdom era were all bad kings. They were all wicked kings. And so you get after a couple hundred years of this, God says, you know what, I've kind of had enough of this, guys, and starts moving them into this next era. Israel goes first. Judah follows a generation later. Israel is actually captured, is defeated in battle, and many of their people and a lot of their wealth is taken away by the Assyrian Empire. And we'll talk about empires in a couple weeks. The Assyrians came by. And then a generation later, the Babylonian Empire took over the Assyrian Empire, and they just kept heading south, and they came down, and they actually hit into Judah, and it was the Babylonians who defeated the nation of Judah, carried away captives and gold and all the stuff from the temple and all kinds of stuff. This next era is called the era of exile. E-X-I-L-E, I think the line is there. The exile. And it was the time when most of the influential people in Israel were either dead or in Babylon. And then later Persia, as the Persian Empire came up. So it covers these times when a lot of people were living outside of the land of Israel. Now, what do you suppose would be the main historical book of the exile? Let me back up one. How long did the exile last? 42 years. That is not correct. This is one of those exceptions to the rule. 70 years, good. The exile was about 70 years. There is no primary historical book for the time of the exile. So I think you have a line there for primary historical book, and you want to write the word none, because there isn't any. What knowledge we have of the time of exile comes from the book of Daniel, right? So Daniel was writing. He was a prophet, lived during the time. And so we get some details from this time period from him. What other place might we get some historical input from this time? That's actually, no, sorry, no, it's just that one. That's sorry. This next book covers the next period. My bad. All right, so Daniel. Now, where is the place? Mentioned a couple place names in quick succession. Let's see if all of you got that one. It's in your notes, isn't it? Babylon and then Persia. Because the Babylonian Empire came in and they conquered the Assyrian Empire, took over all of their land and then kept moving. And then literally a generation later, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, took everything that they had and expanded even further. And so the Israelites who were under Babylonian rule just kind of transferred over to being under Persian rule. But there was still there was a Jewish community that was in Persia as well. All right, so that's the place. Who is the person, the key person during this time period? Cece. No, David is long dead. Talara. Daniel. Daniel is the key person in this era. It is because of Daniel that we know what we do know. All of the great stories, Daniel and the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, all of the great intensive prophecy that's in the book of Daniel. All of this comes, and it's even Daniel who figures out how long the exile is going to last. And so a lot of this stuff is all there in the book of Daniel during this exile. Let's see. Do we have time for one more? Or should we stop? We're past time, so I'll stop. We started a couple minutes late, but it's all right. We'll stop. We'll pick it up right there. Don't worry, we're a lot going. All right, so how many eras have we gone through? Ben? Roughly 7. You like that word roughly, huh? It's a great number. A great word. Roughly 7. How many are there in total? 12. Right, so we have a few eras yet to get through. All right, any questions? Any last questions about the content? Okay, Gideon. Luke. Okay, that's a prayer request. All right. Let me pray quickly, and then I will send you out into the night. How's that sound? Father, we love you. We thank you for the night and the opportunity to look at your word. Lord, I thank you that you have given us something that we can look at. We can kind of take it apart a little bit, and we can understand the major pieces and how they fit together. Help us to understand your word and understand the pieces so that when we look at individual verses and individual chapters or books, we have a sense of where they fall and what they might mean because of that. So help us to learn, we pray in Jesus' good name.